The summer of 1928 came to Harlem like it always did. Loud and sweet and full of promises it had no intention of keeping. But on the night of July the 14th, the thunder arrived first. It rolled in from the Hudson like a slow, deliberate warning, and by 9 o'clock the rain was hammering 133rd Street so hard you couldn't hear yourself think. Then the electricity went out. Every block, all at once, swallowed whole by the dark. In the basement of a building that had no sign above its door, behind a red curtain that smelled of tobacco and gardenia, the velvet room breathed on. Candles were lit, glasses were poured, a trumpet player in the corner found his melody again, softer now, as if the darkness had taught him something about restraint. The club had survived 2 years of prohibition, 3 police raids, and the slow erosion of ordinary mercy. It would take something far more intimate than a thunderstorm to bring it down, something it was already holding inside. The velvet room was hers. Everyone who walked through that red curtain understood that in their bones. Loretta Voss, Queenie, to anyone with the sense not to call her anything else, had built this place with her own money, her own nerve, and a silence she'd bought and paid for from 3 different aldermen. She moved through the candle-lit room that evening in a gown the color of crushed blackberries, touching a shoulder here, accepting a glass there, laughing at the right moments and saying nothing at the rest. But her eyes were working. They were always working. At the bar, Chester Franklin polished his glasses and watched the door with the careful anxiety of a man expecting a bill he can't pay. Ellison Beaumont held court at a corner table, reciting something from memory to 2 women who leaned toward him like flowers toward a window, but his bourbon sat untouched, and his eyes tracked Queenie every time she crossed the room. Dutch Remy stood near the back hallway and spoke to no one. He never spoke to anyone here. He was simply present, the way a loaded revolver is simply present. Young May Collier was on the small stage, her voice curling around a slow ballad like smoke around a lamp, and if anyone noticed that she was singing about a woman who had been betrayed by someone she trusted, they did not say so aloud. And at a private table behind a velvet screen, barely visible in the shifting candlelight, sat Carlo DelVecchio, white, overdressed, and profoundly unwilling to be seen. At 10:47, the trumpet stopped. Not because the song ended, because May Collier stopped singing. She had gone to find Queenie, to beg, if she had to ask for one more chance. And she had walked through the back hallway, past the storeroom, and pushed open the door to the office and found her. Queenie was in her chair. Her hands were folded in her lap with an almost terrible neatness. Her eyes were closed, and on her chest, placed precisely over her heart, was the Queen of Spades. May's scream cut through the rain and the candle smoke and the murmured conversations, and for a long moment no one moved. Then the trumpet player set down his horn. Chester Franklin knocked over a stool getting to his feet. Ellison Beaumont went very still in a way that had nothing to do with shock. The back door at the end of the hallway, the only other exit from the building, was sealed shut by the flooding alley. Water black and rising in the gap beneath the frame. No one had come in that way. No one had gone out that way, which meant the Queen of Spades was still in the room. By the time Sergeant Amos Pruitt arrived, called by a neighbor who heard May's scream even over the thunder, the room had already begun to close in on itself. Pruitt was 43 years old and had spent 16 of those years learning to find the truth in the narrow spaces the law left for men like him. He stood in the doorway of the office for a long moment before he touched anything. He looked at the card. He looked at the position of the hands. He looked at the single glass of bourbon on the corner of Queenie's desk, 2 inches from the edge, which someone had set down in a hurry and which had left a wet ring on a folded piece of paper beneath it. He did not pick up the glass yet. He did not pick up the paper yet. He simply memorized the room the way you memorize a face you know you'll need to recognize in the dark. Then he walked back out into the candle-lit hallway and told the assembled guests, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of a man who has stopped needing to raise it, that no one was leaving the velvet room tonight. He questioned them one at a time, in a booth near the stage, with a single candle between them and the rain doing its patient work against the windows. Chester Franklin said he had been at the bar all evening, which was true as far as it went. He did not mention that he had visited the office at 9:15 to have a conversation with Queenie about the partnership agreement, a conversation he described as routine. Two people sitting nearby remembered raised voices. Dutch Remy said he was owed a conversation and had been waiting to have it. He said this with the flat economy of a man who measures every word before he spends it. He did not say what the conversation was about, and he did not look away when Pruitt held his gaze. May Collier wept with the full unguarded openness of someone who has nothing left to hide. Or who wants you to believe that. She said Queenie had been her everything. She said it like a eulogy and like an accusation at the same time. Carlo DelVecchio said, repeatedly and with increasing volume, that he had been in the private booth all evening, and that this was not his concern, and that he had people who could confirm he was somewhere else entirely, if that became necessary. Sergeant Pruitt wrote all of this down without comment. Then he asked Ellison Beaumont where he had been at 10:45, and Ellison Beaumont smiled the careful smile of a man who has spent his life composing exactly the right words, and said he had been at his table. Pruitt nodded. He did not write that one down, he didn't need to. Pruitt returned to the office with a second candle. He lifted the bourbon glass and set it aside. Beneath it, the folded paper had absorbed the wet ring, and the ink on one corner had run slightly, but not enough to obscure the first three words. I know everything. It was not a threatening note left by the killer, it was a note Queenie had written. Pruitt understood this because the stationery bore the club's own watermark, and because a pen with a cracked nib, the same cracked nib that had made the particular break in the letter K, sat in the cup on Queenie's desk. She had written this note and been about to send it. The question was to whom? A further search of the office turned up two things of interest. The first was a locked cash box beneath a loose floorboard, standard practice for a woman in Queenie's business. Inside it were ledgers, a small pistol, $400, and a bundle of letters tied with red ribbon. The letters were love letters, every one of them signed with the same name, a name that belonged to a man who had told Pruitt he had never met Queenie outside of professional matters. The second thing was simpler, a single ink stain on the arm of the visitor's chair opposite Queenie's desk. Fresh, the shape of a fingertip, left by someone who had touched something inked tonight and then gripped the chair arm. Someone whose fingers, if Pruitt looked carefully enough, might still show a trace. It was Chester Franklin who broke first, not because he was guilty, but because Chester Franklin had been breaking slowly for years, and this was simply the night the fault line gave. He came to Pruitt without being asked, sat down in the booth and told him everything. He and Queenie had argued at 9:15 about the partnership clause, the one that would give Chester full ownership if certain conditions were met. Chester had wanted out for 2 years. He was tired of the bribes, the risk, the careful daily performance of not being afraid. He had drawn up papers. Queenie had looked at those papers and laughed, not cruelly, but with the absolute certainty of a woman who knows her own leverage. She had told Chester that she knew about the arrangement he'd made with an alderman the previous spring, an arrangement that had nothing to do with the club and everything to do with Chester's own ambitions. He could not afford her silence to end. He had motive and no alibi for the critical window, and his hands shook so visibly when he spoke that two of the other guests glanced over from across the room. The case against Chester Franklin was building itself with terrible efficiency. Sergeant Pruitt listened to every word. Then he looked at Chester's hands. They were trembling, yes, but they were clean. At midnight, Pruitt asked everyone to return to the main room. The candles had burned lower. The rain had not let up. They arranged themselves the way suspects always do, in small clusters that revealed more than they concealed. Chester Franklin sat alone, spent, his glasses on the table beside him. Dutch Remy had not moved from his wall. May Collier sat with her arms wrapped around herself, her gold dress suddenly garish in the grief of the room. Carlo DelVecchio stood near the bar with his arms crossed and his jaw set. The posture of a man who has decided the best defense is to look like he's above all of this. And Ellison Beaumont sat at his table with his untouched bourbon. Still untouched, Pruitt noted, after 3 hours, and looked at the ceiling as if the answers were written in the smoke. Pruitt stood at the front of the room with his notebook closed. He didn't need it anymore. He had been doing one thing all evening, while everyone else was performing their innocence. He had been watching who watched whom. Dutch Remy had watched Queenie's office door. Chester Franklin had watched Pruitt. May Collier had watched the room, cataloguing exits the way someone does when they feel hunted. Carlo DelVecchio had watched Beaumont, and Ellison Beaumont had watched his own hands. A man who has done something with his hands will watch them afterward, the way you keep returning to a word you know you've misspelled. Pruitt walked to Ellison Beaumont's table and asked him, quietly, to show him his right hand. The room went very still. Beaumont looked up from his ceiling and then looked at Pruitt for a long moment, the look of a man calculating how much the truth has already cost against how much the lie will run. Then he placed his right hand on the table, there on the pad of his index finger, barely visible against the dark of his skin but undeniable in the candlelight, a crescent of dried ink. The same cracked nib pen. Ellison Beaumont had been in that office. He had sat in the visitor's chair, left the ink smear on the armrest, and he had written something, or read something, or helped himself to paper from Queenie's own desk. The bourbon glass had been his. He'd carried it in, set it down on the note Queenie had written him, "I know everything," and hadn't noticed where he put it until it was too late to move it without drawing attention to the note beneath. The Queen of Spades had come from his jacket pocket. Queenie had given it to him weeks ago as a joke, a calling card she'd called it, for a man who always played the hidden suit. He'd kept it. Tonight he'd used it. The letters in the cash box were his. Love letters to a man whose name did not appear in any of his published work. A name that in 1928 Harlem could end a career, a marriage, a life. Queenie had known. She had been gentle about it for a long time. She had asked for his silence on certain matters in exchange for hers. But she had grown bolder, and the note, "I know everything," had been the final demand. Beaumont had come to negotiate. He had found that there was no negotiation left. He had done what desperate people do when they believe they have no other choice. He had taken the choice away from everyone else. By 2 in the morning, the flooding had receded enough for the back door to open. The rain was still falling, but softly now, the way rain falls when it has finished saying what it came to say. They took Ellison Beaumont out through the front, under the red curtain, and up the narrow stairs and into the wet street, and the Harlem night received him without ceremony. Chester Franklin sat in the booth for a long time after, his partnership papers folded in his coat pocket, useful now for reasons he had not anticipated. May Collier walked out into the rain without an umbrella and did not seem to mind. Dutch Remy left the way he had arrived, quietly, through a side door, into a Harlem that had already started redistributing its power structures in the dark. Carlo DelVecchio went downtown and never came uptown again. In the back office of the Velvet Room, someone had placed a fresh candle on Queenie's desk, and in the last hour before dawn, it burned down to nothing. She had built something real in a world that did not extend her the full courtesy of existence, and she had protected it with everything she had, and in the end the thing that brought her down was not a gangster or a raid or the long patience of the law. It was the oldest story there is. She knew too much about someone who had too much to lose. The Queen of Spades. She would have appreciated the irony. She had, after all, always been the most dangerous card in the room.